Hello and welcome to week 6 here at Plant Biology at NICC. We'll be continuing our reading this week in Biology 2E OER textbook. So we're still in the same text as we were last week, and that's where we're going to stay. To start, I would like you guys to go back and reread section 30.5. That'll give you a refresher on water movement and the movement of nutrients in plants, and that's going to tie into what we're going to be talking about today, which is soils and plant nutrition. Soils and plant nutrition are important and linked because much of the nutrition that plants get comes from soils. These nutritional requirements in plants can be broken down into two major categories. We can talk about macronutrients and micronutrients. The macronutrients are, as the name would imply, macro, big things, the nutrients that plants need a lot of. Things like carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium. These are the macronutrients. These are required in larger amounts by the plants to build their structures. Also, you can think about the micronutrients, things they need in less concentrations. Molybdenum, iron, nickel, sodium, things like that. They're all important and they're all essential, but different amounts are required at different parts of growth for plants. We talk about soils and nutrition together because when we're talking about at least land plants, which is sort of the main focus of what we're going to be talking about, the soil is really the source for these nutrients. Plants pull carbon in from the air via photosynthesis, and oxygen in the air as well. But the rest of those nutrients are really coming from the soil, or at least the substrate they're rooted in. And that's an important, necessary piece of information when you're thinking about plants, is that what their roots are exposed to is really what the plants are going to be able to get. So this nutrition that plants need really comes from the soil. And soil is, I'll say, an often underappreciated component of the world in which we live. Soil is a fantastic resource. It's not a single thing either. If we look at soil composition, it's made up of inorganic material, so stuff that isn't alive and maybe never was alive, but it's also made up of organic matter. And depending on the type of soil, there can be a lot of organic matter or little organic matter. If you're looking at, say, a wetland soil that has decades and decades, if not centuries, of plant material that's died and is decomposing but very slowly, there may be very high levels of organic matter in it. If you're looking at a desert soil that's pretty much just sand, the organic matter in those sorts of soils is going to be very, very low. Also, contained within the soil is going to be water and air, often sort of not really thought about as part of the soil, but definitely part of the soil. Also, let's not forget about the microorganisms that live in the soil, as well as the macroorganisms. The earthworms that move through the soil are important and necessary components. Fungi live in soil. Bacteria. All of these things combine to make this amazing sort of structure that we call soil. When we look at different parts of soil, we can look in and understanding how the soil was formed. Different soil formation characteristics are going to result in different types of soil. If a soil is formed in a very sandy area with a sandy sort of rock and inorganic base, it's going to have more of that. That shouldn't be too surprising, but again, these are things to think about when we're talking about soil and soil formation. This parent material is important. We can talk about climate. Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it dry? Is it wet? All of these different factors play a role in how this soil is going to form. How steep is this soil? Is it steep? Is there a lot of things moving past and over and through it because of erosion, or is it flat and stable and accumulating? Biology is important too. What sorts of microorganisms exist? What sorts of organic matter gets deposited? If there are trees, the leaf litter accumulates as part of the soil, part of the humus. If there are no trees, that's a different sort of component. If you're in Iowa, like I am, you can look out at these prairie soils that we have are an accumulation of these organic materials from centuries and centuries of prairie growing on top of itself and dying and depositing that organic matter. That type of soil is very, very different than, say, the soil found in a mountainous region where you have steep slopes, very rocky parent material with a lot of water and erosion forces moving through it. Time also plays a big factor. If soils have been in place for a long time, they're going to be more mature. If you're building a brand new soil, which definitely happens for sure, if you have a disturbed site, so if you, let's say you open up a surface mine, you put the soil back on, you start to revegetate it, that's a very new soil. New soils act differently than mature soils, and the characteristics of those soils will change in response to those differences. One of the important components that we can talk about in soil is the nutrient content. Nitrogen, for example, is a necessary element in the development of plants, and it's one that is often a limiting factor in how well and how big plants will grow in their ecosystems. Plants overcome this lack of nitrogen in the soil ecosystem by sort of hijacking or utilizing other processes to bring nitrogen, which is abundant in the atmosphere but unavailable, to a form that's available to plants. And they do that through a process called nitrogen fixation. They use bacteria that can convert this atmospheric nitrogen into this usable ammonia form, which plants can then use. Nitrogen is an essential element when we're talking about the development of amino acids. So protein development, plants have proteins. This protein development would be impossible without this fixation of nitrogen by these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Critical component to soil bacteria. Also within soils are what are called mycorrhizae, or we have these symbiotic or these mutually agreeable relationships between plants and fungi. Fungi are really, really good at breaking things down and making them biologically available. So if we look at mineral breakdown, a lot of that is done by fungus in the soil. The fungi are able to break down the inorganic materials and make them available organically. The plants then utilize that relationship with the fungus and are able to take those nutrients for themselves and use it. These interrelationships between plants and bacteria and plants and fungi are critical to plant health and plant development. For the most part, that's how plants interact sort of intimately in that way with other organisms. There are also plant parasites. Nutrients for plants can be a very limiting factor. If we look at, say, the Venus flytrap or honeydew, those are plants that are growing in very, very nutrient-poor places, and they've adapted to their environments by collecting these nutrients from animals. They're not eating those animals for caloric intake like, say, humans do. So if I ate a fly, I would gain some calories from that as well as some nutrition. The plant captures and breaks down that fly, doesn't get any calorie usage from it, but definitely is able to harness the nutrition in there. There are also some rather strange parasitic and saprophytic plants. Parasites are organisms that grow on another organism and harm that plant. Dodder is the plant that they use as an example of a parasitic plant in the book. Very interesting in that it's not photosynthetic. It just simply parasitizes other plants. Saprophytes, those are organisms that grow on dead and decaying matter. In the case of the Dutchman's pipe, which is the one the example they give, this is a non-photosynthetic plant as well. There are only a few of these non-photosynthetic plants. I think it should be clear or made clear that these non-photosynthetic parasites and saprophytes are definitely the exception. But they do exist, and they do represent a very interesting difference in biology of plants. For the most part, plants are photosynthetic, and they live in the soil, or they live in aquatic environments, and they sort of exist in regular plant ways. Another common way that plants exist is as a symbiont. So they grow in association with another plant or another organism. Plants, I guess, not other organisms so much. Sometimes they grow on big plants, things like that. plants have a wide diversity of ways of gaining nutrition, and all of those different ways are really, really important when we're talking about the development of the plant as an individual. So how is that plant gaining the nutrition it needs to grow its physical self? And also the development of plant communities. Are there enough nutrients to support a larger population of certain types of plants versus other types of plants? That will influence what sorts of plants can grow in an area, and that will change the plant community. These questions are interesting depending on sort of what scale you're looking at. So if you're interested in, say, agriculture, where you're really focusing on an individual plant, you might be much more concerned about how does nutrition affect individual plants. So if I'm growing soybeans, I want to know what I need to do to my soil to maximize the growth of my soybeans. If, however, I'm interested in restoring a mining site, I want to know what sorts of things need to be in the soil, what sorts of bacteria need to be there to fix nitrogen, what sorts of fungi need to be in there to help liberate some of these inorganic materials to make plant development of broader communities possible. So if I'm starting from a blank slate and I want to grow a forest in Virginia, that's very, very different than what does my crop look like this year of Iowa soybeans. They're not better or worse, they're simply different focuses for what you as an individual might be interested in. So to recap, we're going to be looking at soils, we're going to be looking at plant nutrition, we're going to be looking at nutritional adaptations. So how do plants really interact with the soils and the organisms around them in these sort of symbiotic and mutualistic ways. This is a fascinating topic. I hope you enjoy the chapter, and we'll talk to you next week.